Our speaker today is Professor Deepa Kumar, who teaches Media Studies and Middle Eastern Studies at Rutgers University in New Jersey, US. She has 3 books to her credit. The first one is called Outside the Box, Corporate Media, Globalization and the UPS Strike, which is about power of collective struggle and effectively channeling the priorities of neoliberalism. A second book, which I'm presuming where the talk is going to be from, is titled Islamophobia and Politics of Empire, which looks at how the Muslim enemy has historically been mobilized to suit the goals of empire. She's currently working on a third book about political Islam, US foreign policy and the media. She's much sought after public speaker and has spoken at dozens of university and community forums on a range of topics, such as Islamophobia, political Islam, US foreign policy, the Middle East, and so on and so forth. She's shared her expertise in numerous media outlets, including BBC, NPR, USA Today, and so on and so forth. So I invite Dr. Deepa Kumar to come and give the talk. The title is Constructing the Muslim Enemy from Crusades to 9/11.
Thank you for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here. I was just telling Vishnu, this is my first talk in India. I travel around the world giving talks, and perhaps that's because I don't study India, and that's my first caveat. I study the United States, I study the Middle East, I don't study India. But I think it also has to do with the fact that when I come back home, and Bangalore is my home, I'm always under the radar, not available to anyone, spending time with my family, but I'm really glad that I was invited here, and this seems like a great place to begin speaking in India. One more quick caveat. Since I don't study India, I won't be talking about communalism in the Indian context, and I hope that in the discussion period we can talk about the ways in which the West has framed the Muslim enemy and parallels, if there are any, in the Indian context, or divergences, if there are any as well. So today I'm going to focus on what I cover in the most recent book, and that is the ways in which, for the last millennium in the West, in Europe, in the United States, particular types of constructions of the Muslim enemy has been used by the political elite in order to advance their agendas, right? And in doing so, it's funny that I'm here at a time when there is so much chaos going on in the United States around the Boston Marathon bombing. I think people may have read about that. I was in Japan at the time, and then when the Tsarnaev brothers were, discovered as being the perpetrators, I was in India. So I missed the drama that actually happened in the US. But one thing that was clear from reading a range of news media outlets in the United States is that the association between Muslims, violence, and terrorism is now complete. That is to say, there is no hesitance. It's now become an automatic, knee-jerk response that when Muslims do something, and even if they happen to be white, as in the case of these 2 perpetrators, it's Islam that made them do it. And I say it's become knee-jerk because there used to be, at least during the Bush era, some degree of nuance, some degree of questioning, because of course Bush was just so in your face, right? You may have seen his wanted dead or alive posters of Osama bin Laden, mission accomplished, where he lands this helicopter onto a ship and so on and so forth. So that sort of cowboy attitude and the hubris and the arrogance of the Bush administration actually created some pushback and some space, at least, for resistance of this narrative. But in the last 5 years, this narrative has been sold very effectively by the Obama administration, who has pretty much carried on the same policies of the Bush administration, albeit in nicer language, in more sophisticated language. So today we have the language of liberal Islamophobia, which is backed up by liberal imperialism. And I won't be able to talk about that. I talk some about that in the book. But today I'm just going to focus on sort of the most obvious kinds of constructions of the Muslim enemy that we've seen in the United States over the last 30-some years, but also the precursors that go back to Europe and starting with the Crusades. So I'm going to start with, I'm a scholar of media studies, but I don't believe that the media are responsible for these sorts of constructions and images all by themselves. In fact, they emerge from the political sphere and then get reconstructed, reflected, and in all sorts of ways shaped by the cultural sphere. There is no one-to-one relationship, but I do believe that there is a sense in which political agendas don't get hatched by the mainstream media, but rather come out of the political, economic, and other spheres of power. So I'm going to begin by showing you this ad from 2010, and you watch it and then we'll talk about it.
إذا كمشوني هذا هدفنا، تعال تقتل الكفار كلهم، سلم نفسك، ساعتها بالعزلة، القرويين تبعهم، المحاميين تبعهم، الأخبار، التلفزيون، كل مصر رسالتنا للعالم كله، ساعتها هذا طريقنا الوحيد للسلم.
My name's Dan Finelli. Send me to Washington, and I'll send our enemies where they belong, and that's not to a courtroom. Does this look like a terrorist, or this? It's time to stop this political correctness and the invasion of our privacy. Let's face it, if a good-looking, ripped guy without much hair was flying airplanes into the Twin Towers, I'd have no problem being pulled out of line at the airport. This is an airplane. And this is a terrorist. Send me to Washington and get rid of that bum Alan Grayson, and I'll make sure guys like this get nowhere near things like this. I'm Dan Finelli, and I approve this message.
Okay, so there's absolutely no nuance or subtlety of any sort. He is teaching us in a very pedantic fashion what a terrorist looks like, and in case you're confused, he pulls out this older white man and he says, does this look like a terrorist? And you're supposed to say, no, no, not at all, because white men don't commit violence in the United States. They don't go around shooting kids in schools or at movie houses. I don't know if people know what I'm referring to, but there was a mass shooting at a school recently, before that at the Batman movie and so on. Obviously, those people are not terrorists, apparently. It is only brown-skinned men who are terrorists. Now, the good news is that Dan Finelli actually didn't win the election, but the fact of the matter is that this is the extent to which the far right has taken this rhetoric, but liberals, unfortunately, are not far behind. Now, what I'm going to argue in this presentation is that the Muslim enemy is a construction, by which I mean that there is no reality on which this is based. Rather, it is a particular kind of story that gets told by, they are historically rooted constructions, and these constructions are largely used and mobilized by the elite. And their main goal, really, in doing so, is to justify larger political agendas. So right now in the United States, after the Boston Marathon bombing, civil liberties, that is, the ability to go to court, to not be imprisoned indefinitely, to have free speech, those have been under attack in the United States, at least for the last 2 decades, and certainly more so since 9/11. After the Boston Marathon bombing, even more so. When the guy was apprehended, he wasn't allowed to, he wasn't given his Miranda rights, which basically are rights to have a lawyer present before you get interrogated by the state. That was completely denied, and that's really been the progression, is you create fear and paranoia and hatred, and then you take away the rights of everybody because you're justifying it through this fear, through what I call the green scare, actually, which has been mobilized quite effectively. Now, I'm going to argue that this is largely a construction, and that in fact there is nothing natural about it, and there is in fact no ancient conflict supposedly between the East and the West. Now, you may have heard of this term clash of civilizations. That's the title of this slide. But if you're not familiar with the works of Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis, I'll just quickly go over what their thesis actually is. So here's how they put it. Now, Bernard Lewis is an Orientalist scholar, and I'll talk very quickly about, very soon, rather, very shortly, about Orientalism. But he is somebody who made a name in the UK, moved across, took a position at Princeton University, and in a famous, or I should say infamous essay called Roots of Muslim Rage in 1990, he coined this term called clash of civilizations. And here's how he put it. He said, quote, "The struggle between these rival systems, by which he means Christianity and Islam, has now lasted for some 14 centuries. It began with the advent of Islam in the 7th century and has continued virtually to the present day. It has consisted of a long series of attacks and counterattacks, jihads and crusades, conquests and reconquests." And then he goes on to conclude that this form of rivalry, this kind of clash, is no less than a clash of civilizations, the perhaps irrational but surely historic reaction of an ancient rival against our Judeo-Christian heritage, our secular present, and the worldwide expansion of both. In other words, he takes 14 centuries of history and he pulls out the moments where there have been conflicts, and it is true that there have been conflicts, and he suggests that the key relationship that characterizes East and West is one of clash of these supposed civilizations. Now, it's Samuel Huntington, who is a political scientist at Harvard University, who takes this term and writes first an essay called A Clash of Civilizations, and then publishes a book called The Clash of Civilizations. He's the person who's responsible for popularizing this notion. And here's what he puts forward. He says, basically, the underlying problem for the West is not Islamic fundamentalism, it is Islam, a different civilization whose people are convinced of the superiority of their culture and are obsessed with the inferiority of their power. In other words, what he does is he looks at the world in the post-Cold War period, right, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he says conflict is no longer going to be characterized by political differences. Instead, they are going to be characterized by cultural differences, right? For Huntington, there are about 7 or 8 civilizations, quote unquote, that populate the earth, the Western, the Islamic, the Confucian, and so on and so forth. And he says that all of these civilizations have such unique cultures and such unique cultural values that they are just bound to clash with one another, right? And so the question is, what is it that characterizes the West? What are the qualities, the cultural qualities that define Western civilization? I pulled a quote from his book. He says, "Western ideas of individualism, liberalism, constitutionalism, human rights, equality, liberty, the rule of law, democracy, free market, separation of church and state, apple pie, all things wonderful, sunshine, air, all this is associated with the West, whereas apparently in Islamic societies, these notions have absolutely no resonance." So you see here a very Manichaean, polarized notion of us versus them, and we're everything good, and they're everything bad. Now, this whole thesis, which actually has been used to great effect since 9/11, when they first put forward these ideas, Huntington and Lewis, they weren't very popular, right? Back in the 1990s, the first Bush administration and the second Clinton, and the 2 Clinton administrations didn't actually adopt this ideology, but after 9/11 it becomes extremely popular. And you think about it, some of you are here from a nationalism course that you're taking. You've probably read about how during the period of colonialism, European colonialism of not just India, but also of the Middle East, of North Africa, and so on, it was necessary to bring into being a body of ideas that would serve to justify colonialism, right? And Edward Said, whose book Orientalism you may have come across in that class, actually looks at how in various spheres, whether it's literature, political writing, encyclopedias, paintings, and so on, this body of knowledge that comes into being really is all about justifying colonialism, right? And one person that you may have come across in school is Rudyard Kipling. I know when I was in school, we went to see Jungle Book and read parts of Kim and so on, and didn't have even the slightest critical appreciation of what was going on. Of course, you learn that only later. But Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden, in which he argued that the colonized, that is people like us, are characterized by 2 things. One, we are either half devil or half child. And he used that very specifically, right? Because if you're half devil, you need to be vanquished. You need to be disciplined. Violence and force needs to be used against you because you cannot be tamed just through rationality, and therefore violence becomes important. But half child, why half child? Because the child must be emancipated. The child is never equal to us. And therefore, it's the white man's burden to go in, to colonize, and to bring all of these things that apparently have no resonance in our societies, things like individualism, human rights, equality, liberty, the rule of law, and so on. So what you see really in the 1980s and 1990s is a kind of neo-Orientalism coming into being, except of course that after the era of decolonization struggles in the post-Second World War period, right, national liberation struggles from India to Algeria, it's no longer possible to say, yes, we want to take up the white man's burden and go civilize these people. That's just racist and that's unacceptable. And so now you have these ways of retooling what is essentially the same idea, which is that the West still is the best and these people need our help in order to be uplifted and so forth. Now I want to argue against this idea by actually referring to the real history, if you will, of the contact between East and West. And if you look at the real contact between East and West, what you see, and medievalists, there's a scholar by the name of Norman Daniel who's actually written really well about the medieval period. He says that for the first 400 years of contact between the Islamic empires in Europe, very little was actually known about Islam itself. Just by way of quick history, as people know, Islam developed in the 7th century in Arabia, in the Hijaz region of Arabia. And very soon the Muslim armies were able to defeat the neighboring Byzantine and Persian empires and take over large parts of their land. And in the 8th century, they entered Europe and actually establish a kingdom in Spain and reached all the way up to Italy, Portugal, and so on. This was called Al-Andalus, and I'll come back to Al-Andalus shortly. But at any rate, obviously this incursion drew alarm in Europe. You know, the Europeans didn't like their lands being taken over and conquered and so forth. But at this point, during these first 400 years, the Muslims were not seen as being any different from any other of the other barbarian invaders, people like the Magyars and the Normans and so on and so forth, the Slavs. But in the 11th century, something changes and the Muslim enemy comes into very sharp focus in the 11th century. And all of a sudden, the Vatican is commissioning studies of this new religion, encouraging its scholars to actually develop material that can be used against this new enemy. And there are 3 lines of attack that they come up with in terms of how to construct this Muslim enemy. The first was the idea that Islam's revelations were pseudo-prophecies, they're not real, they're not like Christianity, they're not real prophecies. Second, Muhammad is a false prophet. And third, Islam is an inherently violent religion. Now the first 2 ideas are ones that persist today to some extent, but it's only the really conservative far right wing in various countries that actually, you know, will resort to these sorts of notions. But the third notion that somehow Islam is uniquely violent, and here, by the way, I have no interest in either defending Islam, attacking Islam, defending Christianity, or attacking it. My concern really is about the accuracy of history. And that is not what you see at work in the people who mobilize these particular kinds of images. Now, the third image, that Islam is violent, where it comes out of is the fear among the elite, particularly the Christian elite in Europe at the time, that not only were they losing their lands, but people were converting. You know, large numbers of Christians and Jews and so on were actually converting to Islam. So how do you explain this? If your religion is superior and you have the true prophecies, and Islam has all the false prophecies, etc., how do you explain it? Well, one standard explanation is that people are being forced to convert. You know, they're doing this at knife point, gun point. Well, they didn't have guns, so I guess knife point at that time. And that's why people are joining this religion. Actually, that's not true, because in fact, the Muslim armies and the rulers gave people a choice. They said you can convert, or you pay a tax, and you can live as second-class citizens under our empire. And it's not because somehow Muslim kings were more tolerant than Christian kings or what have you. It's because this is the religion that comes after Christianity and Judaism. And so there's an appreciation that since it's all the same God, these were earlier prophecies, these were earlier variations of God's word, And it's fine, you can continue to practice them. You may not recognize the true light, but it's okay. They weren't killed and they weren't prosecuted and so on, in a way that other religious groups would not have the same sort of tolerance. At any rate, so the explanation that Islam is violent really doesn't hold up. And so they also looked for other explanations, right? Why are people converting to Islam? You know, the papacy was just terribly bothered by this. And so another interesting explanation is because of sexual indulgences, right? So Islam actually permits men to take 4 wives, allows divorce, even allows the divorced women to remarry. And as you might imagine, the papacy and the Vatican viewed this with horror, right? Because in Christianity and Catholicism, it's one woman, one man till death, destruction, and so on, do us apart. And so the idea that men could take 4 wives, they theorized that that's why all of these men are actually converting to Islam. In fact, I do a couple of, I've been on my book tour for the last few months, and some people have asked me to talk about women in Islam. And I've done a lecture on 19th century paintings, Jerome and Delacroix and so on. And it's so fascinating that the attention to the harem has existed from about the 11th century to till today. And it's always been a case of sort of sexually repressed Europe projecting its fantasies onto the other, onto the Islamic world and so forth. And how it changes through time is just so interesting. I don't have the time to talk about it. But suffice it to say that used to be the story, at least until the 19th century. And then of course today it looks very different. Today it's more like we are liberated in the West, they are repressed and so on. And there's an interesting history, and the women's movement has to do with it and so on and so forth. At any rate, let me summarize from Norman Daniel the kind of propaganda that was created in the 11th century about Islam. Actually, you can read, so I'm just going to let you read.
Whose quote is this?
This is from the book by Norman Daniel, who's done the comprehensive study of the propaganda.
It's him saying this.
It's him saying this. So his scholarship has found that Muhammad was said to be a magician, a Christian priest who couldn't get power, sexually promiscuous, adulterer, and then of course all the stories about how he was devoured by dogs, suffocated by pigs, etc. This was part of popular fiction at the time. And so in every way possible, you know, the religion was slandered, and the Prophet was slandered as well. And the question is, why was this systematic form of propaganda created at this moment? You know, did it just come out of thin air? Absolutely not. There were larger political agendas at work. In particular, the Reconquista, which is the term given to the reconquest of Spain. I mentioned earlier that in the 8th century, the Muslim armies invaded and took over Spain and Portugal and parts of Italy and so on. By this point, to some extent, Europe was coming out of what were called the Dark Ages, which is the cultural, economic, and social decline that they went into. So they wanted their land back. They wanted to reconquer their lands. And what better way to corral people into joining armies than this kind of hatred of these infidels who must be vanquished from our land and sent back home. But more powerful than the Reconquista really are the Crusades, and the idea that Christians are being tortured in the holy city. It's our holy city. Never mind that all 3 of the religions in this region all lay claim to Jerusalem, and with good reason. But nevertheless, it was the idea that poor Christians are being tortured. We need to go rescue them and liberate Jerusalem from the infidels. And in fact, if you look at some of the stuff that the Vatican puts out around this time, a particularly radical band of priests had actually taken over the Vatican. And their goal in mobilizing this kind of vicious propaganda was less about themselves and actually had nothing to do with Christianity, but more to do with extending the power of the Vatican over a united Christian Europe, right? I've got quotes in the book where the Pope is saying, well, brother should not fight brother in Europe. We should come together and focus our attention out there on the Muslim enemy. So the idea was to create this united Christian Europe over which the papacy would have political control, and to extend the influence of the Vatican into the Middle East, into the Byzantine Empire, and so forth. But even at this time, when these vicious images were being constructed, there were contradictory notions that ordinary people actually had in their heads. I mentioned earlier that Muslim rule, the 800-year Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula was referred to as Al-Andalus. As Europe was going through the Dark Ages, Al-Andalus was far, far more advanced. In fact, there were advances made in the fields of philosophy, medicine, astronomy, architecture, urban development, and so forth. Actually, much of the scholarship is fairly recent. It's come out in the last decade or so, where people have gone back and done archaeological work to show that had it not been for the work of Muslim as well as Christian and other scholars in Al-Andalus, modern medicine as it is would not exist. And similarly, architecture, and so on and so forth. Now, as you might imagine, for the Christians who lived in Al-Andalus, they're part of this flourishing civilization. They didn't have the same sort of attitudes that the Crusaders would actually have. And I've got a small clip from a BBC documentary. It's called, what is the name of the documentary? An Islamic History of Europe, which I really recommend because what it shows is that Islam has always been central to the development of European identity and is not Europe's other. So I'm going to play a small clip from that.
200 years, Cordoba grew. The 11th century saw a flood of converts drawn to Islam. These were mostly Christians inspired by Abdurrahman II's benign rule. The mosque had to be extended, and Cordoba began to attract some of the brightest stars from the Middle East.
There's a chap called Ziryab who arrives from Baghdad, and Ziryab is often described as a Beau Brummel of Moorish Spain, because he was like a master musician. He was based in Baghdad, and he fell out with his master, the guy who was teaching him music. Came here as an exile and brought with him all the fashions from Baghdad. Baghdad was like, the Paris or the New York of its day. And what happens is you've got this influx of ideas from Baghdad to Cordoba. So he sort of brought things with him like toothpaste and deodorants and things like short hair. Like men and women all had long hair until Ziryab turned up, and he said, no, but everybody in Baghdad, man, they just have short hair. You got to just cut your hair. It meant that they're sort of part of this bigger picture, and it's like part of a
much more sophisticated picture.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking at this time when London was a bunch of mud huts by the Thames. I mean, this is the famous thing. Cordoba, they had street lighting, they had sewage works, they had running water, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, the problem is that we tend to view Western civilization as somehow a combination of classical civilization combined with Christianity, and that's it. But there's this huge element missing from that picture, which is the Islamic element, and that comes through Spain, mostly through Spain, partly through Sicily as well. So you've got the Greeks and the Indians and the Persians who had not been very well connected until that point.
And had their little sort of sealed areas of achievement.
That's right. So what the Muslims do is they conquer all these territories, join all these beads of mercury together, and it becomes this great font of knowledge.
And the critical thing is that a lot of the works that they were translating from the Greeks in the Western world, by this stage, had been forgotten. So if Islam preserved the wisdom of the Greeks long after it had been forgotten in Western Europe, what did the Muslims actually do with this ancient knowledge? Did they merely hand it on, as some people have argued, or did they create something new with it?
They created something new with it. And if you want to see the rest of this video, it's Google it. It's available online. You shouldn't have a problem getting it. But I took some time going through this history because I think it shows quite clearly why this notion of clash of civilization is actually based on a historically distorted notion of the relationship between East and West. Because in fact, had it not been for the translations, as you just heard, being done, and the advancements that were made in any number of fields, the Renaissance, which is when Europe definitively comes out of the Dark Ages in the 14th century, would never actually have happened. And so rather than these cultures and these civilizations also existing in isolation, never mingling, that's simply not true. In fact, world civilizations have commingled, have intermingled, and often when people come into contact with each other, they have developed respect for one another, and certainly that was the case in Al-Andalus. And one more quick thing about this period, which is that even though the political elite actually mobilized these stereotypes about Muslims, they were perfectly fine, they were perfectly content to make alliances with their Muslim counterparts. So in fact, even during the Crusades, the Christian crusaders were making alliances with the Muslims were making alliances with the Christians, and the same would happen later on during the era of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans would actually ally with various powers who, particularly the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, and they would go up against Catholicism, the Habsburg Empire, and so forth. So there have always been these alliances among the elite, even though propaganda really is something meant for the masses. They kind of see through it themselves and act in their political interests. So I'm going to move, I guess, 14 centuries and come to the United States. And this brings up to the Muslim enemy in the US context. Just very quickly, Orientalism, as I mentioned earlier, is a body of knowledge that comes into being in the 18th and 19th century in Europe. And the US actually is not a colonizer in the same way that France and Britain and other countries colonized. So in the post-Second World War period, when the US actually takes over the reins of the Middle East from France and Britain, it inherits some of this language, which is why people like Bernard Lewis, who I mentioned earlier, would take a position at Princeton University. All of these people have seen that the winds of power are shifting across the Atlantic, so they come and provide the knowledges and so forth. But so it's largely a second-hand kind of construction in the United States. But the first moment really in the post-World War II period when the Muslim enemy comes into sharp focus is during the Iranian Revolution, and particularly the hostage crisis of 1979 to 1980. On November 4th, 1979, US personnel were taken hostage and held for 444 days. People have seen the movie Argo, yes, which is a depiction of this. And it was during this time that Iranians became front page headline news in the United States. And it was a particular caricature, as Edward Said argues, that comes into being at this time. In particular, you would see certain rituals being conducted every day almost on American television. US flags being burned, right? That scene gets reproduced again and again and again. Iranians marching in the streets, not as political agents who might have any genuine grievances with the United States, but as these mobs, as these unruly mobs that must be controlled. Angry, scowling faces, particularly of their leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. And while we see a complete dehumanization of the Iranian people, the hostages and their families were interviewed, right? These were shown as people with hopes and dreams and desires and so on. And that's exactly the technique, isn't it, of demonization, is you humanize the heroes and then you completely remove any sense of humanity from the people who you want to villainize. And that's exactly what takes place. And you think about it, you know, this is the image that was constructed in the 1980s in the US. Argo reproduces that with absolutely no nuance of any sort. If you haven't seen the film, you should. After all, did win the Best Picture award at the Oscars. And I suppose to his credit, since Ben Affleck is part of the somewhat liberal tradition in Hollywood, he spends the first, 3 minutes talking about how the United States overthrew a democratically elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, in 1953. Why? Because he actually had the audacity to take Iranian oil and want to use it for Iranian people. He nationalized the oil industry, therefore cut into the profits of Western companies and so on. US couldn't have that, so they overthrew him, replaced him with a Shah, who then ruled with an iron fist and completely destroyed democracy in that country. So to his credit, Ben Affleck spends 3 minutes of the film actually going through this history and explaining why some people in Iran might have real political grievances with the United States. But the rest of the film is entirely about mobs, about the burning of US flags, and about completely illegitimate political struggle apparently that Iranians are involved in. And I teach media studies back in the States, and people will say, Professor Kumar, you're reading too much into this. It's just a film, it's just entertainment, enjoy it. And it's like, okay, if you think it's really just entertainment, why do you think at the Oscars, Michelle Obama, President Obama's wife, gives the award to Ben Affleck surrounded by US soldiers? It's because they know it's propaganda. If our side is not critical in deconstructing this propaganda, then we simply accept the worldview of the people who are powerful. And sometimes that convinces students, other times it doesn't. So that's why we have a whole semester. At any rate, Khomeini becomes the face of evil. This is Ayatollah Khomeini. I disagree with his politics, and certainly I think he led the counter-revolution in Iran. But I think this is a ridiculous way to represent a political leader, regardless of what differences we may have. He looks positively satanic. This image is, he's white, he's pale, his eyes are jaundiced, he looks angry and scowling. And it is a construction, quite literally. This is a, this is a sketch. And in that little picture, you have Carter, Jimmy Carter, who was the president of the States at the time. He looks positively angelic. I mean, that looks like a halo, right? The light over his head actually looks like he has a halo over his head. And there you have it, good versus evil, bad versus good. I'm going to quickly move ahead. This is the idea that Islam never changes, the Middle East never changes, therefore the US has to invade and replace its leaders. Here's a comic strip. I don't know if you all still read Batman, but when I was growing up in Bangalore, I was an avid Marvel Comics fan. And I read Batman. Here is Batman as a representative, apparently, of Iran. And I chose that really because insanity really becomes a way in which to describe the actions of anyone who disagrees with the United States. You must be crazy, you must be irrational, because surely you can't disagree on rational grounds with anything that the United States actually does. And in fact, in the 1980s, which is where this cartoon comic strip is from, tactics like hijacking, kidnapping, or the use of violence by groups get seen in this way as insanity, and the people who are doing this sort of action get branded as terrorists. And that really is the current language that we have today, the idea that anyone who resorts to this kind of action is a terrorist. I'm going to quickly do a history of the notion of terrorism as it applies to the Middle East. Israel, by the way, is very, very pivotal in developing this idea of first Arab terrorists, and second, so-called Islamic terrorists, and in particular Benjamin Netanyahu, who I loathe, and thankfully have enough ammunition to really criticize in the book. He organizes two conferences at which he develops this language where the enemies of Israel, he says, are the enemies of the world, right? And so at first that was Arab terrorists, but in the second conferences, in 1984, that becomes Islamic terrorists, if you will, and the key shift during this period is between the secular and the Islamic. And I'm going to zoom through this because, yeah, these are subway ads that we've seen all over New York City, which is where I live. Just absolutely disgusting. And you see here the language of colonialism, right? On the one hand, you have the civilized man. On the other hand, you have the savage. And that's, by the way, how Indians were talked about as well, right? The uncivilized, the savage, the barbaric, who the British had to civilize. And to find these sorts of ads in the 21st century in New York City, in San Francisco, really speaks to the extent to which not only is Zionism a colonial project, but the extent to which this ideology has become so accepted that you can have subway ads like this. By the way, it didn't go uncriticized. Christian and Jewish groups have actually taken out ads against this whole line of attack. But I want to show you one last video, and that is, I mentioned earlier that it is in the political arena where this language of the Muslim enemy emerges. But Hollywood in particular has a way in which the roots of an idea get taken up and then get constructed in all sorts of ways. So I'm going to show you a small clip of how the image of Muslim terrorists comes into being from the 1970s to about the present.
The movies that we see basically follow Washington's policies. It's reflected in the cinema over and over again, particularly during the 1980s and the 90s, where you had perhaps 30 films which showed Palestinians as a people who were intent on injuring all Americans.
How may we help you, Jack?
One of the most despicable portrayals of Arabs and Palestinians occurs in the 1987 film Death Before Dishonor. First, they murder a guard, and then slaughter an Israeli family. Kidnapped and tortured an American Marine, and in cold blood executed another. And they burned the American flag right in front of the American embassy, and then dispatch a suicide bomber to blow it. One reason we've not been allowed to empathize with any Palestinian on the silver screen is due to two Israeli producers, Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus. These two filmmakers created an American company called Canon, and they released in a period of 20 years at least 30 films which vilify all things Arab, particularly Palestinians. They even came out with a film called Hell Squad, showing Vegas showgirls trouncing Arabs in the middle of the desert. I think the most effective film we've ever done, one of the most popular and most racist, is The Eleventh. Here Palestinians hijack the planes and terrorize the passengers, especially the Jewish ones.
Take out the passport with Jewish names.
There is no form of communication more powerful than film in creating propaganda, and Golan and Globus do it to another level. Certainly American producers play a role in vilifying Palestinians. I mean, perhaps the most anti-Palestinian film is True Love.
This apparently is the same group which just detonated a nuclear bomb in the Florida Keys.
Crimson Jihad will rain fire on one major U.S. city each week until our demands are met.
This film is shown on television almost every day, over and over again. It is part of our visual heritage.
Give me the key! Come on, child! You don't want to die, do you? Give me the key! And you won't get hurt! I give you my word!
No way, you wacko!
And we never see Palestinians who suffer under occupation, Palestinians in refugee camps, Palestinians who are victimized, who are killed, innocent Palestinians. These images are denied us. Now, why are they denied? Is there an unwritten code in Hollywood saying we cannot and will not humanize Palestinians? I mean, why can't we humanize Palestinians in the same manner in which we humanize Israelis? Is not the life of a Palestinian child, media-wise, Hollywood-wise, politically-wise, as important, as humane, as valuable as the life of an Israeli child? And if the answer to that is yes, why can't we see that on silver screen?
Okay, so I focused a lot on the ways in which Arabs in particular and Muslims in general have been constructed as terrorists. But these are not the only frameworks. You also have a framework that Mahmoud Mamdani calls good Muslim, bad Muslim, where the good Muslim is one who actually supports the project of empire, is pro-US, pro-West, and so on, whereas the bad Muslim is anyone who disagrees with that, not just the fundamentalists, not just the people who turn to violence. And what I argue in the book is that Islamophobia is a form of both cultural and biological racism. That is to say, it's cultural in that it's the whole idea of a clash of civilizations, it's the belief that their culture is just so backwards and so forth. But it's also biological because when you look at this enemy image, in places where images are seen, it's not of Indonesian Muslims, it's not of Malaysian Muslims, it is largely of brown and sometimes black men. And so if you've seen what's happened in the United States since 9/11, it's not just Muslims who've been, put into jail, deported, and so on. It's also Hindus, it's also Christian Arabs, it's also Sikhs, it's been Parsis, and people who are not necessarily Muslim in their religion, but because they look a certain way, they're automatically seen as being enemies, as being people who should be policed by the states. And so in that sense, Islamophobia in the 21st century has both a cultural as well as a biological dimension, but most importantly, it has a gendered dimension. Because for the most part, the terrorist is the male terrorist, right? It's the Arab brown male terrorist. And if I may reframe, and I have reframed Rudyard Kipling's half devil, half child, today what we have is half terrorist, half victim, and that's a gendered story because the woman, the Muslim woman, largely gets presented as a victim who the West needs to go off and rescue. So particularly since 9/11 and the war on Afghanistan, you've seen Muslim women being depicted in these sorts of ways, as timid, as cowed, as oppressed, as Gayatri Spivak put it. This narrative actually goes back quite a few centuries, and it's the narrative of the white man needing to rescue the brown woman from the brown man, right? And that story gets retold again and again, and most recently in the context of the Afghan war. Here are, so not only are they individually oppressed, but even when they're together, look at the body language, they're scared, they lack political agency, they're simply there as objects to be rescued by the West. But in fact, this is not true, as we know. And the most recent example of women's agency, political agency, comes from what's called the Arab Spring, what I call the Arab uprisings, because they're not over, they're not limited to one spring. The struggle continues. So here we have a woman in a full burqa who you expect to be a victim, but here she is in Egypt carrying a sign that says, down with Mubarak. More pictures from the Egyptian uprising in January and February of 2011. There are both hijabi and non-hijabi women. I travel a lot in the Middle East, and of course it's the complexity of the people who live in Egypt versus Lebanon versus any of the other countries is so immense that you never quite get to see that in Hollywood films because the script doesn't allow for that. So I'm going to come to a close with this and open it up for Q&A. So what I've tried to argue in this presentation is that there is nothing natural about the image of the Muslim enemy, rather it's constructed at particular historic moments in order to serve political interests. Deconstructing these images involves, as Saeed put it, reading against the grain and having a sense of empathy with the other. It's shocking, but when I give these talks in the United States, and I get all sorts of people in my audiences, I actually have to say, you know what, just like in the US, where we have far right-wing people who go around doing bad things, there are far right-wing people in Middle Eastern countries who also do bad things. And I'm not asking you to identify with them or to condone what they do, but just like in the US, most people are regular and normal, as in any other society, so too is the case in the Middle East and so on. It's funny that I have to actually tell the story. And I think it's hardly funny in a sense, because that's the depth of propaganda that's been unleashed in the United States. And as I said in the beginning of my talk, I don't study India, but I'm struck, I've been away now for 21 years, I've lived in the States for 21 years, but I'm struck by how every time I come back, I've seen a greater and greater communalization among my friends, among people who I would assume know better. And I had a student who recently completed a dissertation on the ways in which Star TV and the K serials in particular have really sort of codified a certain image of the Hindu extended family and of nationalism, particularly Hindu nationalism and Hindutva ideology, which has become much more accepted and naturalized in the sort of post-BJP era. So, of course, these are, I don't study it in any depth, but suffice it to say that the processes by which certain groups, in this case Muslims, have been demonized have occurred in different parts of the world, in India for sure, but also Israel, in Europe, and in the United States. finally, the last thing I'll say before throwing it open for discussion is, I think the way forward is not simply to read against the grain and simply to take classes like I'm sure the class on nationalism is fabulous, that's great, but we have to put these ideas into practice in the real world, as Gramsci called it, praxis. And so somebody remembered me as a person who was an agitator standing outside and asking people to sign petitions and go out on demonstrations. Because I think really fighting against negative stereotypes isn't simply an intellectual pursuit. It actually involves real solidarity, which means standing up for things that don't affect us directly, but that affects our brothers and sisters around the world. And you actually saw some of that in the United States after the Egyptian and Tunisian uprisings in Wisconsin, Madison. In Madison, Wisconsin, I'm sorry, Madison is the capital of the state called Wisconsin. And the governor of that state was actually passing these horrible anti-union laws. And people who came out to the Capitol, many of them my friends and so forth, were carrying signs that said, "Fight like an Egyptian," because they were inspired by what people in Egypt had done. And also signs which said Hosni Walker, mishing together the governor, Scott Walker's name, with Hosni Mubarak's name, basically making the argument that neoliberalism, which is the regime, the economic regime we live under, affects people everywhere. And so a victory for people in Egypt is a victory for people in Wisconsin. We have to stand together, and that's what solidarity means. So I'm going to stop there and throw it open to your questions and comments. And please feel free to disagree with me as well if you like. Very hesitant.
Working on India, but I have worked on India. And this argument of postmodernist argument of construction of the way you look and the way you are looked at has also been made in the context of caste. Colonialism played an important role in constructing caste identities, and sometimes exaggerated form it is made. Now, if you look at Indian history from a longer term perspective, you realize that there are always processes, intellectual, aesthetic and ideological processes, by which certain fractures are amplified and reinforced. But there is a material basis lying behind the fractures. So, the argument that you develop, at the end of the day, what is the conclusion I draw? The conclusion I draw is, let's try and change the way we look. That doesn't take us anywhere. It doesn't take us anywhere when you look at communalism here, it doesn't take us anywhere when you look at caste, and it doesn't take us anywhere in the kind of work you're looking at. So maybe the attempts like Huntington at characterizing intrinsic differences are caricatured. But religions shape the way you think. Religions shape your relationship with resources. They shape your relationship with each other. And there are differences in the way people perceive ethics, aesthetics, other values. So I don't think we can stop this argument by saying that there is only a misrepresentation. There are actually fundamental differences in points of view. And unless we recognize these fundamental differences in points of view, I don't know to what extent we can really take the argument and understanding forward.
Okay. First of all, let me agree with the first part of what you said, which is that I'm not a postmodernist. I don't think that it's purely discourse that produces all of this, these images and so on. I think images exist within a material context, which is why I call the book Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, because it's ultimately about the projection of political power that necessitates certain kinds of constructions. It doesn't, sort of fall out of nowhere. And it is that material reality that has to be changed if we're going to actually change the circumstances in which these constructions are mobilized. However, I think that difference is articulated along any number of lines. There are political differences within nations, there are religious differences within nations, and how people acquire a worldview isn't simply about religion. I don't see religion as being the fundamental or the primary or the most important realm through which people come to see the world. It plays a part, no doubt. But at the end of the day, I mean, if you look at the protests that are going on in Egypt right now, the Muslim Brotherhood is in power. They got voted by a majority. And yet, workers who have not seen, who've seen that the Muslim Brotherhood are carrying on the same Mubarak neoliberal regime are protesting against them, because there's only a certain extent to which religion can be a cement, right? Those of you who are studying nationalism probably have studied how Hinduism gets mobilized by the Congress Party and so forth. And certainly Islam was used in Egypt by Nasser and so forth. There's no doubt that religion plays a role in national liberation struggles, but there's so much more complexity at work that I think we've got to parse out where these differences come from and look at the people that we can actually stand in solidarity, I think on the basis of politics, not on the basis of religion. That's my take on this.
But it's interesting that you haven't emphasized on the fact that the so-called, like he said, there are fundamental differences. The conservative aspects of Islam, that there is an imperialist agenda of empowering the conservative Islamic entities, as for instance, you refer to the Iranian coup, but then bringing of Khomeini itself, there is a lot of suspicion about CIA involvement there. And then of course Taliban story everyone knows. So the struggle within the quote unquote Islamic countries against such whatever, if you do wish to characterize it as conservative aspect of Islamic culture or whatever, that struggle is also subverted. I mean, the images of Kabul University that we know from before 1980 and what we have today. So while there is this quote-unquote construction of civilizational conflict, there is also this perpetual attempt to subvert the struggle that goes on, not just in Islamic countries, elsewhere too. So that, I thought other than that mention of the coup in 1953, the rest of it, you kind of, I don't know, maybe you didn't find it important to emphasize, because, that's how we have Mahmoud Baq, that's how we have Taslima, or, so many others, or say even Rushdie. So how do you kind of put that in place?
Well, I emphasized every chapter in the book. Unfortunately, I don't. So I picked what I thought was useful, but your point is valid. And I do have, let's see, 2 chapters on the Middle East, and particularly around the rise of Islamic fundamentalist groups, which is a historically new phenomenon, right? That is, these groups did not exist in any, as a political force, in fact, up until the 1970s. Yes, the Muslim Brotherhood was founded in the 1920s, Jamaat-e-Islami also was founded in the 1930s, I believe, and so on. But they were largely marginal players because it was secular nationalism in all of these countries that actually held political hegemony. And so the question is, what is it that actually cedes the political ground to these forces in the internal struggle that takes place? Now, part of the story, because I'm largely writing to a Western and American audience, is you have to tell the story of how the United States actually cultivates these forces, right? So when Nasser, who is one of the most sort of charismatic figures of secular nationalism in Egypt, Nasserism actually becomes this form of political revolution that others in the Middle East want to try to emulate and so forth. When the US tries to co-opt Nasser and does not succeed, when they try to co-opt Mossadegh and they do not succeed, they realize that they need an opposition strategy. And that doesn't begin in 1979 with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. It begins in 1958 with the Eisenhower Doctrine. And they develop what's called the Islam strategy, where they want to create they actually in the State Department call it, they want to create an Islamic Pope to act as a counter to Nasser, and they look at the King of Saudi Arabia to be this Islamic Pope. And it's through US sort of giving the green light to Saudi Arabia using petrodollars to Islamize politics in the region, that ultimately, and of course, these are the failures of Nasserism as well and secular nationalism in general. They are unable to deliver on their promises economically, politically. After the 1967 war with Israel, they're defeated. In that vacuum, that's when these forces come into being. So absolutely, what we've seen is battles within these societies of how can we advance our economic, political, and social interests, and who are the forces best capable of representing us. And that's where the Islamists have come into, but that's not the end of the story, because they come to power, and usually because they're a petty bourgeois, largely a petty bourgeois organization, they don't have solutions. They vacillate between appeasing the US and then appeasing people, and they discredit themselves, and then they get elected out. And so that is a struggle that continues today, and I think that the hope really comes from the Arab uprisings in Tunisia, in Egypt, and so on, where a new future and a different kind of way of looking at these societies is coming into being. So yes, I do spend at least 2 chapters on all of this.
So they're looking at the West, the US refuses to see diversity among Muslims. Similarly, amongst the conservative Muslims also, there is a process of internationalizing issues. So there is they want to there is the constructing of an Islamic international Islamic identity. It is not coming from the West alone. Even among terrorists, for example, they talk about right from Bali to Kashmir to Kosovo, everything is an Islamic issue. So the construction of an Islamic identity comes from within also. They refuse to see. So there is a process of Arabization itself. Like for example, like in Pakistan, they don't want to. Many people refuse to say Eid Mubarak. They say something else, some Arabic term, because Eid Mubarak is a slightly more Persian term or something like that. They actually use a different way of greeting themselves. So there is a process of Arabization because Arabic is more Islamic. So that kind of standardization and that standard thing is that is the pure form of Islam. That kind of Islamic identity is getting created, and that is not just being reinforced by the West. That process is also, there is something internal also.
Right. I agree with the first part of what you started with, but the second part I think takes you to some more dangerous places, and let me explain why. First and foremost, it's absolutely the case that the people who allied with the United States, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood, the Mujahideen, whoever, they are, sort of mirror images of each other. So you will have the right in the United States saying, oh, these people want to take over, the entire world and create a caliphate from Europe to Indonesia. That's where the second part of what you're saying, I think, is a little problematic, because I don't think it's the case that the extreme fringe wing of the Islamist movement somehow is representative of all Muslim people, whether it's in Pakistan, whether it's in Egypt, whether it's in Iran, what have you. There's a left in all of these countries. There's a secular left. There's a liberal left. There are women's movements in all of these countries. And there's a diversity of opinion. And I think when we try to sort of generalize from the actions of the people who actually get all the attention in the West, we do a great disservice. And by the way, on the question of gender, there have been 3 men who spoke, so I'd really like to encourage a woman to raise a question or a disagreement or a comment.
Okay, can I just make a comment before that?
Sure.
The shift from Allah Hafiz to Allah Hafiz in Pakistan actually happened, officially sponsored shift, happened during Ziaul Haq's period. Ziaul Haq is known to be an American student.
Absolutely.
And there was hardly anybody saying Allah Hafiz before Ziaul Haq actually sponsored it. And of course we know what Ziaul Haq was.
Absolutely. In fact, local elites, not just the Saudi elite, but from Ziaul Haq to all sorts of leaders, have implemented a program of Islamization for their political benefit. Absolutely no doubt about that.
I'd like to make a comment on this comment.
Sure.
And my comment is based on the fact that I've lived and worked in Pakistan for 4 months on one occasion, and I've visited Pakistan many times after that. While what you say is absolutely correct, it is also true, as she says, that there are many other groups in a country like Pakistan For example, there are Punjabi enthusiasts who will say we will not say Khuda Hafiz. It smacks of Farsi. We will not say Allah Hafiz either. This is Arabic. We will say Rab Rakha. Right? So there are people of that kind. And secondly, everybody who says while Allah Hafiz came into play at a certain time period and as a result of the backing of the state, I know from my own understanding of Indian Muslims that everybody who says Allah Hafiz doesn't really think in terms of fundamentalist Islam or in any kind of hardened category of Islam, right? It's like making the argument that look, don't move from Namaste to Namaskar, right? So there are a whole lot of people who would simply say Allah Hafiz as a simple greeting, as hello, that's all, right? And then go back to Khuda Hafiz and move between the two very, very frequently. So, I mean, I'd just like to add that little caveat. But I agree with you that Allah Hafiz came into play at a certain time with the backing of the
So
state.
my point was actually in response to what you were saying, that there is a certain Arabization of the lexicon that is taking place. My point is that if at all there is any truth in it, this is precisely what the imperialist West has been attempting. So the struggle within these countries towards a more progressive culture, towards a more progressive future has been subverted repeatedly by the imperialist West. That is the point I was trying to make.
That's correct. And it's not a coincidence that Saudi Arabia was involved in the Zia-ul-Haq regime. They actually gave the funds to set up all these schools. The Arabization, as it were, is very much part and parcel of the US's foreign policy agenda, at least from 1958. And they gave the money for this. The Islamic banking system, which was set up with petrodollars, was actually shepherded. I mean, Saudi Arabia didn't have the know-how to do this. It was actually the Goldman Sachs's, it was the neoliberal gurus of the Chicago School that actually set this up, which then funds the Islamists and the Islamization of the society. So, we've got to look at all of these layers. I have the hand of one gentleman here, but I really want, yes, thank you.
I was curious if you explored positive constructions in your book, whether they exist and if you explored them.
Excellent question. Let's take both and then I'll come back. Or if you have a comment, that's fine too.
Could we be making the same mistake in the opposite direction, the way we have been going in last about 5-10 minutes? Earlier you tried to say that Islam as an enemy is being constructed and everything is bad in Islam, and that's how that springs from the political. And now we are saying that everything is political and the civilizational and religious ideas and ideologies play no part. So one party is saying that nothing is political, only the religious ideas are playing part, and the counter example you are constructing is that everything is political and religion is really of no consequence, or it is of very minor consequence. Are we making the same mistake in the opposite direction? I also have another little thing to say. The second part of the same thing emerged in this discussion a little bit later, that even in the Islamic societies, if something is happening which is very sort of retrograde and fundamentalist, then that is also being happening because the American imperialists want that. So that's very interesting, which means that in Arab, the kind of, in Saudi Arabia, the kind of society which is being constructed under the Wahhabi Islam, US is not only an ally for its own strategic or whatever political gains, but also has vested interest in creating that, and this is being created by them. So it seems that we are going in the, making the same mistake on the opposite direction. That's precisely what Punendu was saying, that there could be some material realities which perhaps have to be recognized.
Okay. Let me come to your question first and then your point after that. That's exactly why I showed that image from Al-Andalus, because in fact during that time people had a lot of respect for Muslims. So Christian and particularly scholars from Europe, Christian and Jewish scholars, all flocked to Al-Andalus because here was knowledge and growth that was happening. And there was a completely, so in other words, I do the long history in 2 chapters, right? It's not always been the case that there are negative images. 11th century, massively negative image. And then it starts to peter off. There are positives at the same time. Then it starts to peter off because Europe gets involved in the process of nationalism and the formation of national identities. And the Muslim enemy is no longer that important because now they're fighting each other. The United Christian Europe is falling apart, and so on and so forth. And then there are Genghis Khan. What was he? Who is he? The Mongols. Now present themselves as an enemy as well. So this whole idea that somehow the Muslims were just enemies, all of that starts to change, and people are no longer interested in the Muslims around the 14th, 15th century. Then the Ottomans come into being, and they're a fantastically advanced civilization. So you look at some of the commentary on the Ottomans, and there's nothing but praise for their administrative systems. People would travel to Turkey to learn how they administered their lands, the various land reforms that they had, and so on. And the Turks were actually, the Ottomans were actually seen as Europeans. They're our brothers. They just happen to be more advanced than us, but they're just like us. And all of this is absolutely based on material circumstances, because as long as these civilizations, or these, I don't want to call them civilizations, as long as these empires were more powerful and more advanced, there's no way that you could not respect them to some extent. But once you see the defeat in Vienna and the development of capitalism in Europe, which gives sort of the not only the arms advantage, but also the communication and navigation advantage, then suddenly the Ottomans become, not suddenly, over the course of a century, the Ottomans become the epitome of all things barbaric and all things uncivilized. So in a matter of 100 years, you've gone from great praise for these people to absolutely demonistic ways of looking at them. That's why it's political, because the religion, the Quran, stays the same through all of this. But how the Quran gets seen in the West, how the Quran gets seen in these countries, is always dependent on what is actually happening and what the material circumstances actually are. And therefore, to respond to your point, the Quran itself has all sorts of things within it. There are passages that speak to women's equality, the right to inherit property, and so on. But at the same time, it says all sorts of other things which are negative. A friend of mine, Asma Barlas, has written about this, and she says, look, on the woman question, it depends on who's interpreting the Quran, that they decide which passages they want to take from it in order to emphasize in their societies and how it gives them leverage and so forth. And I think that's the way to look at it, is historically, who are the people who've used these various religious texts, whether this is the Jewish text, whether it's Christian text. Look at Christianity, again filled with such contradictory prose. You look at some of the Old Testament and it says, anyone who disagrees with Christianity, kill them all, kill their babies, put blood all over. Now you can easily go back and say, oh, the Christians are just a bloodthirsty lot, and that's why the Gurdwara killings occurred last year by this white Christian bride. Of course not. That's a really reductive way of taking a religion, the complexity of its manifestations in different societies, and the ways in which particular groups, whether elite groups or fundamentalist groups, have appropriated it for their own aims. At least that's how I see it. Should we take the last round of comments, questions, disagreements? Yes, please.
Yeah, and I saw the picture of Khomeini that you represent. I wanted to add something. Islam, the things that you see outside of Iran, it's not exactly the things that practice inside Iran. As you know that in Iran you don't have any permission to send any journalists from outside of the country, and all the news comes through censorship. In that country, it is not Islam that is going on. It is a politics that's ruling Islam. The Islam that you see outside of the country is completely different. That's why I wanted to say, if you bring Iran as a Muslim country, I think it is a wrong image that you bring make them equal with other Muslim and in other countries. The fighting between Iran and the US is not fighting between Christianity and Islam. It is fighting between two powers. that both of them, they hang on something extra to show. US is hanging just human rights and Iranian hanging to religion. It is only just as a comment that I wanted.
No, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that because in fact, the US's interest in the Middle East has very little to do with human rights and democracy, right? And everything to do with oil. Since the First World War, when Lord Curzon said the Allies floated to victory on a sea of oil, right? Because all of the tanks and the ships and all the rest of it were fueled by oil. Oil has always been central to the so-called national security interests of Western nations. And this is why the US is there. It's not about human rights. I mean, we're talking about Saudi Arabia. There were workers' movements for labor rights in the eastern oil-rich provinces in Saudi Arabia. Aramco, which was then the oil company owned by the US, immediately sends information to the royal family, squash it immediately, deport all the leaders, right? So every time there's been a movement for democracy, for people's rights, for human rights, the US has always acted on the other side of it. But you can't tell the American public, send your brothers, your sisters, your uncles, your mothers and fathers to die for oil. You can't do that because nobody would want to have people maimed and tortured through war and all the rest of it to die. And so you've got to create this rhetoric. And that's where the rhetoric actually comes in. In terms of Iran as well, I mean, I think it's, ever since 1979, it's been the clergy that has appropriated a certain version of Islam. I mean, you probably know all this, I shouldn't be telling you this, but Ali Shariati is the guy who actually adapted Marxism and fused it with Islam. And then Khomeini, of course, just comes in from France and is flown in, actually, to Iran, because God forbid should the secularists actually come to power and overthrow the Shah and so forth. And he just takes over Shariati's entire program, co-opts all of these leftist groups, and very carefully maneuvers around them in order to consolidate power in their own hands. And this is what the Green Movement has been about. Recently, as people know, the election was stolen by Ahmadinejad, and there's been a movement of ordinary people, not just students, not just the elite, but working class forces in Iran as well, fighting back against this kind of co-optation. So, again, they say religion, but it's about their power.
The first group that they started revolution, now none of them are there. They vanish.
Sure.
Either they kill, either they just they arrested. No new group are there that they are practicing politics in the name of Sharia. And the Quran that we receive from them, it is not the Quran that today I am reading here and understanding in this country.
Sure.
It's completely different.
Yeah.
On the question or the point of how America is kind of exaggerating or portraying women as property objects or victims who need to be rescued. I recently, or a few weeks ago, I read this article which was about how the Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt had made a report criticizing the United Nations report that aim to end violence against women and girls, saying it violates the principles of Islamic law. And the major points that they had made had spoken about how granting girls their right to sexual freedom or sort of choosing their sexual orientation and equal rights to adulterous wives, giving wives full rights to file legal complaints against husbands, right to equal inheritance, replacing guardianship with partnership, full equality in marriage legislation such as allowing Muslim women to marry non-Muslim men and abolition of polygamy, cancelling the need for a husband's consent in matters like travel, work, etc. All these points were included and these were vigorously opposed. What do you have to say about it?
They are a fundamentalist right-wing group. Why should that surprise us? This is what right-wing groups in every country do. This is what they need fundamentalists also do.
Is that not a strong enough reason to actually think about them and think about probably rescuing them?
Who will rescue them?
If you are completely blatantly opposing a certain UN document which aims to work for women so strongly, do we not need to actually think about them?
Yes, we absolutely need to think about them. But the way I ended my presentation is that we need to think about them through the lens of solidarity, not through the idea that somehow the US or the UK or France can go in there, drop bombs and liberate people. I think that idea we totally have to reject. Because in fact, if you look at Afghanistan, where apparently Afghan women were going to be rescued by NATO, that's not even the case, right? Some of the most recent studies that come out of the University of Notre Dame show that in every avenue, the situation for the vast majority of Afghan women has actually deteriorated. Other than a handful of women in the capital cities, the situation has gotten worse. And why? It's because the people that the US replaced the Taliban with the Northern Alliance. These are the very same warlords who actually started the attacks on women's rights back in the early 1990s. So the idea that somehow the US or Europe or somehow is interested in women's rights and in upholding those rights is completely not true. And let me say that from the point of view of someone who's been an activist in the States now for almost 2 decades. There are attack upon attack on women's rights right in the United States, right? Whether it's the right of a woman to control her own body, whether it's equal pay for equal work. You might be surprised to hear this, but I actually make less as a female faculty member than some of my male colleagues. I make more than some male colleagues, but in general, women still are paid 77 cents to the man's dollar in the United States. Right? So in other words, that somehow when you don't have equality in the United States between men and women, that the US has any sort of interest in going off and fighting for women's equality in other countries, I think is a bit naive, and we've got to expose that. Instead, we have to look at what people in every country are doing themselves, right, to fight back. And I think that I've given some talks even around the Indian rape crisis and the Delhi demonstrations and so on. Not that because I studied that in any detail, but because right now there is emerging a global movement from Canada to the United States and so on, having to do with sexual violence against women. This is a global phenomenon, right? Rape doesn't just happen in India, it happens in the States, it happens in Britain. So the key is, how do we relate to that? We relate to that as equals through grassroots movements from below, and don't rely on the power brokers to act on our behalf. So I agree with you in terms of your criticism of the Muslim Brotherhood, but I'm inspired by Egyptian women who have fought for their own rights, and it's to them that we need to give our support and our solidarity.
Increasingly with our friends and especially in our family, etc., that when you try to have conversations like this, when you start talking about the hegemony of one culture and portraying another, etc., very often you're faced with very emotional and rigid reactions about, you know what, you don't really know what's going on, you're just picking on these things. And the fact is that, for example, in India, the Muslim population is increasing in the census. Right. So they will take over. It's a very, so it really blunts the efficiency or the clarity of your argument. Has this happened to you, and how have you personally, professionally, or emotionally dealt with these issues, especially in the US with the Muslim enemy?
Right. I mean, I think that the most visceral reactions I get are from Jewish Americans, because the Israel question, there's far more debate in Israel itself about Israel than there is in the United States. You are not allowed to say anything critical about Israel. So last September, was it? I was speaking at a university in Florida, and usually my audiences tend to be youngish, 20s, 30s. And I saw about 20% of the crowd were people in their 70s. I was like, okay, very interesting. I don't know why these people showed up. And so I normally like to talk to people, get a sense of who they are, why they've come for the talk, etc. So I went and spoke to some of them, and they said, yeah, we saw your flyer because the school that invited me sends it out to us for all alumnus and so on. And then I thought for a second, and I titled that presentation, "The Muslims Are Coming." And the subtitle was Racism in the Politics of Empire. They clearly missed that. And they thought, here's this good Hindu woman who's going to say the Muslims are coming, how do we vanquish them, how do we kill them, right? And so I'm talking, and they are shocked by what they hear, and they get emotional. They're like, my brother or sister lives in Israel. How can you criticize Zionism? And so on. Some of them walked out. So, short answer to your question is people do get emotional. They have internalized certain ideas which are not based on fact. It is based on a certain sense of how they have come to see the world. When they get challenged, they do get emotional and they froth, they get angry, they cry, they do all sorts of things. I think the key for me is I tend to be a very calm person. So when the people left, I said, thank you for coming, bye. And about 15 of those people actually stayed till the end. And I argued with them patiently but respectfully right until the end. And of course the other students helped me. And in the end they said, okay, fine, you've changed my opinion on some things. Tell me how to think about this. And I was like, great. We moved them at least 3 steps away with fact, cold, hard fact that gets repeated again and again and that gets substantiated. And you tell them where to find these facts and so on. And they gave me a standing ovation. So I think people can be changed, but you really have to know your stuff if you're going to try to change people's minds. But at the end of the day, you know what? Just lectures aren't enough. This is why I'm an activist. This is why I'm part of social movements, because it's only when you go into struggle that you have a chance of actually changing people's minds and creating a different kind of society. So I would say my advice to you, don't argue with your family. When my book came out, my family said, great, we're so proud of you. They watch all my interviews on BBC and blah, blah, blah. They're proud. But my dad, he's talking to me on the phone and says, why do you have to write about these Muslims? They don't like us, And I was like, well, I'm not going to convince them. I never will. And so the rest of the world is my oyster, not my family. Well, hang on.
Differentiate between the terrorist and the resistant movement. It is taken as those who are victims, they say it is resistant movement. Those who are victimizer, they call it as terrorist. So how can we generally differentiate?
Excellent question. Can I respond and then have you both speak? Of the language of modern terrorism actually takes place in the post-Second World War era, when in the context of national liberation struggles, colonial powers would call the people who were involved in these struggles terrorists. So, Nelson Mandela was considered of the ANC in South Africa, right? He was the leader of, people know who Nelson Mandela is, right? Okay. Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist all the way up until the 1990s because that was the rhetoric. It was the idea that anyone who stood up against colonialism was a terrorist. And this debate actually takes place on the international stage in 1973 at the UN General Assembly, where there's clearly 2 sides to this. On the one hand, there are the newly independent nations, India, Egypt, and so on, who argue that violence in the interests of self-determination is legitimate. And then there is the West, which argues that only the state should have the authority to use violence. Every other kind of violence is illegitimate. So that debate really is one that's played out in that context. But the sad thing is that with the decline of progressive secular nationalism, with the rise of the far right all around the world and so on, now we just see terrorism as, something that individuals do, as opposed to, potentially you could call the US's murder of over 1 million people in Iraq terrorism. It is. And yet that's not, those terms don't get used to talk about the use of violence by the powerful. Last round of hands, then I'll throw it to the two of you.
In many cases, as he also said, so my question is also related to it. If we take example of any act of any terrorist act or any, for example, suicide bombing. So Palestinian suicide bombers are doing terrorist activities. So we think it's illegitimate. But on the other hand, as wars, in the name of wars, the killing of civilians is most of the time people think legitimate. And not only this, whatever act done by any terrorist, we or state, whatever, we don't want to dig most of the time history, what history behind that act of that particular person who has committed that. And for example, in the case of India also, if we see the example of Bombay bomb blast cases, recently verdict has come, and we found the most of the guys involved in that act blast case, most of the people were the guys, I mean, whose family or business was like destroyed at the time of riots, 92 riots. So, I mean, I feel it's like half kind of justice. We think that the people who has committed like blast, so his or her act is like punishable, but the people who provocated riots, I mean, and Shri Krishna Commission already said clearly, like many leaders were responsible for their riots. But I mean, nobody wants to go in the deeper history. So,
Absolutely, I agree with that. Go ahead.
I just want to draw your attention to a question that was possibly sort of got submerged in the discussion, but people alluded to it, which is that yes, of course, it's fine to understand how certain groups and power groups in America construct the Muslim enemy. That is, of course, a very legitimate exercise. But on the other hand, if we have to understand how a sense of the Muslim enemy is created, we also need to know why there's been a lurch to the right in a lot of Middle Eastern and West Asian politics in the countries within, right? And that, does it have anything to contribute to this construction of the Muslim enemy? Also, if we are to fight all this through solidarity of an international kind, then of course it's our duty to understand the politics of the Middle East and West Asia as well. So I think something ought to be said about this lurch to the right since the 1960s. Well, I mean, since the 1980s certainly, but there's a huge change if you compare it to what was there in the 1960s. It was said that Kabul University was a very different kind of place in the 60s.
That's right. I think that's absolutely right. I've certainly written about this in the book. But what I think we should do is place it in its larger global context, because it's not just the Middle East and North Africa that has seen a lurch to the right. Because, for instance, the United States, my first book was about the US, the 1960s actually was a period of progressivism in the United States. You had various social movements for women's rights, against the Vietnam War, for the rights of African Americans and so forth. But since then, you've seen a backlash. And you have seen these ideas largely being marginalized, and the new right, as they're called, from the Reagan administration onward, actually shifting the terms of discussion on every single question to the right. And I think the same thing has happened in Europe as well. So in the last 30 years, we've seen the rise of neoliberalism, which is a new configuration of capitalism, where right-wing forces have actually played a role in pushing back against the progressivism in various countries. And so, absolutely, it is true that the far right has occupied a more prominent position, whether we're talking about Iran or now in Egypt and so on and so forth. But the same is true of the Le Pens, the fascists in France, or of the Tories in Great Britain and what have you. It's unfortunate, but the left as such got somewhat destroyed because of Stalinism, because of the weaknesses of Stalinism. And when the Soviet Union exploded, unfortunately, we still haven't recovered and sort of built a genuine grassroots left tradition. That's the tradition of which I'm a part, which is why I travel around the world, talking about these kinds of issues. But your point is absolutely right, and I do mention that in the book. And we'll take one last comment, question, whatever.
I just wanted to ask, is it only capitalism which homogenizes? Can there not be other systems also which have homogenizing, consequences historically? Because on the question of diversity, especially, but okay, if you take a caricatured case and say compare a Bosnian Muslim with somebody from Sudan, there would be much more that separates them than, apart from the book. But I spent some 4-5 months working in Afghanistan, and I remember the place for its charm, warmth, but I also remember it for a very monochromatic landscape. In a sense, diversity and spaces for differences seem to be relatively low. You see, I had a very lovely friend, old man, Panditji is no more, he was a communist from the pre-partition days. He used to tell me that, Purnendu, there is democracy only in one country. This is not democracy, this is bourgeois democracy. There is democracy only in Soviet Union. Only real elections are held there. Now, what I'm getting at is, that there are, it is true that ideological systems do get shaped by material connections, but they powerfully influence them in return. They powerfully influence them, you see. So I am sort of exploring the idea that Islam too exists in a sense with a capital I. In the same way that capitalism perhaps also can be said to exist with a capital I, and they are both contemporary phenomena. I'm not going to talk about medieval Islam with a capital I, you see. So the scope for diversity, it may be that here is an intellectual, political, ecological, social system which has certain intrinsic properties which are also to be understood if we want to understand the nature of the tension and the conflict that we are discussing.
Can you explain what those inherent characteristics are?
I would have to be a specialist in Islam to explain that, but I can talk about the society in my part of the world where I have studied. My intellectual footprint is very small. It is Western Rajasthan and nothing else, But there I can look at very clear material relationships between culturally constituted populations and the way they relate with each other, the way they relate politically, ideologically, ecologically and socially. And the conflicts that arise are understandable once you start understanding that there are resources, economics, all at work. But to say that people, in common sense language, we negate, we turn it inside out. We say they are like this because this is what they are. We put it, ये तो ऐसे ही होते हैं because ये जाट हैं या ये ऐसे हैं, whatever it is, But actually it's the other way around. And it's the other way around. It is historical experiences that you need to understand which shape them. So by getting into this constructivist kind of position, we sort of moving away from a materialist and historical analysis is what I would try and get at.
I think that's true in general of postmodern analyses, but I'm not sure that's where I'm coming from necessarily. Because there is such a thing as national culture. There is such a thing as regional and local cultures, which absolutely inform the way people behave, right? I was in Japan for a week, 2 weeks ago, and it was my first time in Japan. And it's remarkable how disciplined people are in Japan. I'm standing at an intersection, there is no traffic, nobody, and there's a red light, not allowing the pedestrians to go. Nobody will jaywalk. Nobody will cross the road until they get the signal. I'm taking a subway in Shinjuku, and as soon as there are more than 4 people waiting to get into the subway, they automatically form lines. There's no police saying, hey, don't push or whatever. No, they just automatically form lines. Nobody pushes one another, they all go in. So there is such a thing as national culture. They're extraordinarily polite to one another, and you have a sense in which people behave in certain sorts of ways based on the cultural sort of dimensions which work in their society. And then it was so funny, I'm getting on a plane to Bangalore, and here are our people elbowing, everyone wants to get into the bus first. There's no question of forming a line. It's like, I've got to get there first, no matter when the plane takes off and so on. Because we too have a culture, right? We too behave in certain sorts of ways. So I'm not denying that there are certain things called national culture. But what I'm resisting is the idea that somehow there is something in the Quran, because that is really the only text that is similar to Islam in Indonesia versus Islam in Saudi Arabia versus Islam in Iran and so on, that somehow that has created a culture that is transhistoric and transnational. And I don't think that's true. I think if you visit each of these countries, sort of see the way in which Islam is practiced, talk to the people and so on. I mean, it's Sufism versus Shiaism versus Wahhabism versus all sorts of variation. That idea of a monolithic Islam which somehow has created a structure, I don't have any evidence to that based on my own scholarship.
the media and activism. And I might be completely wrong here, but as far as I see, most of these paradigms which have become very worldwide or global in the sense have had these categories of thought which have lent themselves very easily to popular imagination. So colonialism had the savage, and Indian freedom struggle had the Swaraj, which everybody could, it just caught on like fire. The war against this period has had the free world, where everybody is, Is there any such upcoming category of thought in the culture of solidarity that you're talking about, which can be used by activists, by campaigners to lend itself more easily to the dear?
Right. This is only nascent. It's just beginning, right? Because for the most part, over the last 50 years or so, we've just seen a backlash, as I said earlier, against progressive movements. This notion of solidarity is not new. The notion of solidarity goes back at least several hundred years. It's based on the idea that ordinary people in countries around the world have more in common with each other than they do with their own leaderships, right? And so, for instance, during the First World War, there are moments when, soldiers across various barracks would put down their guns and fraternize with one another and say, no, I'm not going to fight on the German side, I'm not going to fight on the Russian side. That's solidarity. And you're starting to see that again, so that, when workers in the GM plants in the United States went on strike a couple of years ago, you had sympathy one-day strikes in other countries around the world, right? So, and I think the Arab uprisings are really the basis of this kind of solidarity. You really saw people in the UK, in the West, and so on, speaking very positively of what their Arab brothers and sisters were doing. But I think more concretely, it's the idea. Did you get a lot of coverage of the Egyptian uprising in India? Just a bit. Okay. Well, if you watched it in the US or the UK and so on, Tahrir Square in Cairo was really the focus of these demonstrations, right? Just as in Bahrain it was Pearl Square, and in Syria there's another such square. And then you see the rise of something called the Occupy Wall Street movement. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it starts off in Zuccotti Park, which I've been to many times. And it's this idea that public spaces need to be taken over and that people need to come together. That's imitation. That's solidarity, right? And so Zuccotti Park then becomes the inspiration for Syntagma Square, which is in Greece, and in Athens, becomes the basis for, in Madrid, Puerta del Sol. And so that's solidarity, and in each of these places you see solidarity greetings being read out. In Wisconsin, actually, Egyptians sent pizzas to the students who were occupying the student building. So I think we've got to read about these sorts of things, and we've got to talk about how we can pass on, for instance, if we've done something successful, like overthrow a US-backed dictator, as they did in Tunisia and Egypt, write to people who are fighting their own struggles. And certainly the new media, social media, really enables this process. How did you do it? What did you do? How can we reproduce this? What are you doing? How can we learn from that? I think that's, if you have friends on Facebook who are just talking about, I don't know, the new movie, the latest movie they saw, or the latest clothes they bought, unfriend them and try to find people who are actually building this sort of solidarity, because it's amazing how much I learn from Facebook. By the way, some of you friended me. I don't know who you are. Send me a note, and I'll definitely accept your friendship request. Sometimes I'm careful because the US, of course, has all sorts of, there's state funds for the US military and the CIA to infiltrate all of these social media sites and become our friends and sow confusion in the movements. So sometimes I sort of check the backgrounds, but if you have 50 friends in common with me, let's be friends. Thank you. Yes.
Quick last question. I just wondered if you could sort of speak, summarize in say 3 minutes, what is the structure of the book in some ways. In some ways it seems to be an impossible book to write. Covering about 9 centuries and then looking, I'm looking at Crusades and not the formation of the Islamic State. So how did you in some ways decide what were the dates, what were the sites that you wanted to look at, what kind of research went into it? Was it archival in some places? I mean, at some level, one of the questions I have also is, does it not risk falling into the same pitfall? Which is to say, that the moment you say, I'm going to talk about Muslims and Islam from 7th century to now, which then in some ways presupposes the singular figure of Islam, across these 14 centuries, which is precisely what you don't want to do, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, essentially the history of this team doing other kinds of work on neoliberalism, class, and the media, that was my first book. And then 9/11 happens, and wow, in a matter of 1 week, the kind of poisonous atmosphere that you see in the United States is just stunning. Notices go up. I was living in an apartment building at the time. Notices go up. If you see people doing strange things, report it to the police, etc., etc. And who is strange? It's people who look like me who are strange, right? And
true, as a matter of fact.
Yes, exactly. You were.
I was the bearded Arab.
Right. That's right. And by the way, Reluctant Fundamentalist is being made as a film by Meera Nair. I suggest that people.
It's been released, right?
Has it been released?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm eager to see it, but I thought that captures the 9/11 moment and what that looked like. So, I was invited to speak on a panel on why Islam is not the enemy, and I'm like, other than growing up with 2 Muslim neighbors, I have no clue about this religion or about the history and so forth. But in the 10 years as an activist since then, what has happened is that I've, as a participant in the anti-war movement, in the civil liberties movement, I have given, I don't know, dozens and dozens of talks, and always listened to what are people saying, what questions are they asking, and what knowledges are needed to take us forward. So this book is a product of 10 years of that kind of work, shorter articles, shorter presentations, and so on, based around these sorts of questions. And I absolutely say in the introduction that there's no way I can go into every single nuance, but I want to make some larger arguments about the trajectory, about this idea of clash of civilization, about politics inside the US, about politics inside Muslim majority nations, and of course there's plenty more that people show. So this book is really a primer in that sense. It's a broad history with some of the key sort of moments that punctuate both the clash as well as the cooperation between the East and West. Very quickly in terms of an outline, the first section is historical. It's about the Crusades, and it goes all the way up to the first chapter goes all the way up to the Ottomans. The second chapter is about colonialism, and in particular Napoleon's role in constructing what's called enlightened colonialism, right? And so forth. And then how the US gets into this whole picture. And then the kind of narratives and the myths that get woven out of this whole process. The middle section is called Allies and Enemies, and it's about US basically supporting Islamist organizations, but also US policy in the Middle East and in North Africa from about the early 20th century to the present, the rise of the neoconservatives and so on. And the final chapter is domestic, and how liberals have jumped onto this bandwagon as well and created a green scare. So there's the far right and their rhetoric, which is different from the liberals, and their rhetoric, which is different from the centrists. There are all sorts of ways in which these people cooperate with one another, but they disagree with one another, and I've tried my best to catch all of this, and largely because as soon as something happens, the media will phone me. What do you think about this? And I have to have an opinion and an analysis, and then someone will call me to give a talk. So it's just by outside pressure that I've been able to, go through the course of these ups and downs and somehow have a bird's eye view, which apparently I pulled off. So, but you read it and tell me what you think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.